Hello and happy International Women's Day 2025. Welcome to Design Emergency and to one of our favourite episodes of the year, our annual International Women's Day special, in which I, Alice Rawsthorn, and the dazzling Paola Antonelli celebrate some of the extraordinary women designers who, despite their talent, intelligence, ingenuity and ambition, have never received the recognition or opportunities that they deserve. Unsurprisingly, all our hidden heroines have suffered from misogyny, but many confronted other obstacles too, due to prejudice against their heritage, geography, faith, sexuality, and other issues. Against the odds, they've all succeeded in making important contributions to design, which continue to benefit us today. The same applies to the trans and queer designers and designers of colour who faced and continue to face similar challenges. At this exceptionally fragile and turbulent time, our hidden heroines' achievements act both as inspiring reminders of how greatly we can benefit from design culture being as diverse and inclusive as possible, and as cautionary tales of how gravely we would suffer from the loss of those qualities due to ignorance, greed, and bigotry. So, Paola, over to you and our first hidden heroine.
Here, Alice, now more than ever, we need to speak about this. And to double underline what's going on right now, I'm going to talk about a woman immigrant into the United States, Jade Snow Wong, who was born in 1922 in San Francisco's Chinatown to immigrant parents that had come from China's southern Guangdong province. She was the fifth of 9 children in a household that was shaped by strict Confucian values, therefore hard work, frugality, and strict parental authority. Her father was a garment factory foreman and later a successful maker of traditional Chinese furniture. Her mother, quiet and strong, of course, managed the household. And this cultural backdrop shaped Wong's identity and her career. She was raised in a community where Chinese customs persisted despite the pressures of assimilation and the systemic racism. Chinatown was a city within a city, a place of both insulation and survival where Chinese Americans faced limited opportunities and legal discrimination, including restrictions on property ownership and on professional advancement. But Jade was determined to break through these constraints, and she attended Mills College in Oakland, where she studied economics and sociology. But it was during an elective ceramics class that she discovered clay, and it was love at first touch. She later attended the California College of Arts and Crafts, training in a modernist tradition that emphasized function, simplicity, and clean lines. And indeed, Wong's pottery, and later also her work in copper and enamel, is elegant, restrained, simple, wheel-thrown forms finished with beautiful glazes in deep celadons and earthy browns, reds and yellows, and soft whites. Her work embraced both Asian and Western influences and fit comfortably not only within the mid-century American studio pottery movement alongside figures like Marguerite Wildenhain and Gertrude Natzler, but also within the Russell and Mary Wright vein of utilitarian objects that so shaped American lifestyle. In 1950, she published her first memoir, called Fifth Chinese Daughter, blending autobiography with social commentary, and it resonated widely, even making its way onto school reading list. Her talents did not go unnoticed. After all, she was an alien of extraordinary ability, as we immigrants used to be called. The U.S. State Department invited Wong to tour Asia as a cultural ambassador, and this was no minor role. At the height of the Cold War, the government strategically used artists like Wong to promote an image of American diversity and innovation abroad. I was sent, Wong wrote, because those Asian audiences who had read translations of Fifth Chinese Daughter did not believe that a female born to poor Chinese immigrants could gain a toehold among prejudiced Americans. She visited Japan, the Philippines, and Thailand, giving pottery demonstrations and discussing the intersections of art and identity. And her second volume of memoirs, No Chinese Stranger, in which she described these trips, was published in 1975. Is it wrong to always see a dual nature in her work and in her life? Maybe that is why we want to talk about her today, when the whole idea of immigration is under attack all over the world. And I'm going to give it back to you, Alice, for your next hidden heroine.
Well, that was fascinating, and what an extraordinary woman, an incredible role model to so many people in similar circumstances to her. And on to another incredible role model for our gender, and this is Laura Annie Wilson. She was born in 1877 into a family of textile workers in Halifax in northern England. And like most working class girls at that time, she started working half days in local textile mills from the age of 10. And at 13, she left school to work full-time. Laura Annie soon became involved in trade unionism, where she met George Wilson, a local lad who ran a small machine tools workshop in Halifax. They married in 1899 when she was 22 and flung themselves into local left-wing politics. In 1905, Laura Annie chaired a local Labour Party meeting at which Emmeline Pankhurst, the charismatic founder of the British suffragette movement, was the chief speaker, and she persuaded Laura Annie to join the Votes for Women campaign. Laura Annie soon became one of its principal speakers and was imprisoned twice for militancy, always staunchly supported by the loyal and loving George. "I went to jail a rebel," she said, "and came out a regular terror." We should all be those from time to time. When World War I began in 1914, the British suffragettes suspended their campaign in order to support the war effort, and Laura Annie did so by setting up and running a women-only munitions factory in George's by then much expanded workshop. She applied her feminist and socialist principles to its management by insisting on fair wages and decent working conditions, a creche open to avoid women workers having to take time off to care for their children, and realising that many of those women were also missing meals to give more food to their kids. Laura Annie introduced a canteen to provide, as she put it, substantial meals at prices that are marvellous in their reasonableness. The British Ministry of Defence was so impressed that she was seconded to the Midlands to establish similar practices at factories there. They were particularly taken by the realisation that she had made the factory more profitable by investing more heavily in the workers. So a very virtuous exchange. But after the war, Laura Annie began a new lobby for the women who'd worked so hard during the conflict to be re-employed in order to make the most of their skills and knowledge. She also co-founded first the Women's Engineering Society to encourage other women to enter the male domain of engineering, and then the Electrical Association for Women. Laura Annie then ventured into another male domain, designing and building new homes. During the 1920s and early 1930s, she was responsible for constructing over 500 new homes in northern and southern England, as well as for securing all the funding and necessary planning permissions for them. All the homes were designed to be easy to clean and maintain, surrounded by greenery and equipped with gas, electricity and the latest domestic gizmos to give their female occupants time for more productive activities. So Laura Annie's life is a remarkable story of how a plucky and resourceful woman could emerge from a disadvantaged background to liberate and empower herself and then many other women too. As she said of her life, it has been and still is a glorious adventure.
How impressive. I mean, really a terror with a capital T and just inspiring. And it also reminds me how many different forms of design exist and how many different forms of design women are involved in. I'm going to continue with another U.S. immigrant tale. I'm trying to make a point or two here today. And this is that of Lithuanian-born Alexandra Kasuba, who's not an architect and not a sculptor in the traditional sense, but really created amazing, extraordinary environments and formed space with tension, light, bricks, and fabric. She was born in Lithuania in 1923 into a world in continuous upheaval and transformation because of wars, totalitarian regimes, and displacement. And her early education in the arts was interrupted by the Soviet and Nazi occupations of the country. And in the chaos of World War II, she and her husband, sculptor Vytautas Kasuba, fled, at first spending time in displaced persons camps in Germany and then emigrating to the United States in 1947. At first, Kasuba made a living out of painted ceramics and mosaics, small crafts, until she found her medium, architectural surfaces. By the 1960s, she was experimenting with brick reliefs, carving wave-like patterns into rigid structures, for instance, in commissions in New York like an undulating brick wall at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx in 1973, and then an installation of the same kind in 1986 at 7 World Trade Center, which was lost during 9/11. But back in the 1970s, she began working with tensile fabric structures too, with giant stretch fabric environments that eliminated corners, floors, and ceilings as we traditionally understand them. Her live-in environment from 1971 was installed in her West 90th Street in New York, in a townhouse where she reimagined completely domestic space. No right angles, no conventional doors, just an immersive world of curved planes where light filtered through layers of stretch fabrics. Kasuba indeed believed that architecture should respond to the human body and that our environments should be dynamic, not static. And this attitude led her to her shell dwellings in 1989, self-sustaining organic habitats that use tensile materials to form adaptable and efficient living spaces. She envisioned homes that were not built but grown, shifting with time rather than resisting it. And her final major project was in 2005, the Rock Hill house in New Mexico where she lived out her final years. It was built largely by hand and was an extension of her philosophy, blending with a landscape designed around movement and natural light, and being an alternative to the rigid permanence of conventional buildings. Despite her visionary approach, Kasuba never fully gained the institutional recognition afforded to her male contemporaries. But also, she was difficult to categorize, and history often forgets those who don't fit neatly into a box. Her ideas, however, about adaptive, responsive architecture remain very relevant today as designers seek alternatives to the rigid, unsustainable structures of the past, using also new technology that unfortunately she could not take advantage of. On to you, Alice.
Well, what a great story, Paola. And are any of those interiors or the buildings still intact?
Oh, definitely. You can still find remnants here in New York, and the Rock House still exists. But I remembered growing up, especially when I came to New York 30 years ago, I had seen the bas-relief in the World Trade Center. So it's very dear to me. And it was not far from the Louise Nevelson sculpture that also got lost in 9/11. And indeed, Kasuba was going to the forums and salons that Louise Nevelson was organizing. Don't get me started. It's really deeply rooted into the New York that I remember, and it's still around. So I was so happy to rediscover her.
Of course, and I am formally booking you for an architour of Kasuba's work on my next visit to New York, hopefully not too far away. So now we're going to move on to India in the early 1950s, a few years after its independence from British colonial rule, and to Eulie Chowdhury, an Indian woman in her late 20s who'd returned to her birthplace after a cosmopolitan childhood. Her father was a diplomat, in which she studied in Japan, Australia, and the United States, where she started to practice architecture. Having discovered that two of the most influential architects of the time, the Swiss duo Le Corbusier and his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, had been commissioned by India's Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, to design a model modern city on a desolate Punjabi plain, Eulie, as she preferred to be called, applied to work for them. Other women had already qualified to practice architecture in India, but none of them had worked on as prestigious a project as this, which was, of course, the construction of Chandigarh. The great British architect, Jane Drew, was the sole woman among the international team of lead architects, and Eulie was the only woman on the much larger Indian team, as depicted by an incredible photograph of her posing as the lone female among Jeanneret and several dozen of her smiling, crisply white-shirted Indian male colleagues. And I have to thank an Indian designer from the current generation, Nipah Doshi of Doshi Levine, for introducing me to Eulie and her work. Thank you, Nipah. Back to Eulie, who was active in Chandigarh's design, working closely with Le Corbusier on his first building there, the High Court, and later designing the Home Science College, Women's Polytechnic, schools and politicians' homes, among other structures. Critically, she also used her fluency in French and English to act as a liaison and translator between Le Corbusier, Jeanneret, and their Indian colleagues. Eulie worked on Chandigarh from 1951 until 1976, except for 3 years when she was director of the Delhi School of Architecture. After 1976, she continued teaching while becoming Chief State Architect of the Punjab, the first woman to achieve the status of Chief State Architect of anywhere in India, and designing hospitals, schools, factories and railway stations across the country. Staunchly committed to Le Corbusier and Jeanneret's modernist principles of efficiency, economy, and modernity, she was equally assiduous at applying her personal experience of India's climate and geography to her work, particularly in developing new design strategies to withstand the extremes of Punjab's monsoon season. After Eulie's death in 1995, her peers remembered her charm, vivacity, sense of fun, and insistence on wearing Western clothes, which was certainly sneered at by conservative circles in India at the time. Mostly she wore no-nonsense shirt-waisted dresses rather than traditional saris. And her students recalled her strictness. They all seemed mildly terrified of her, and she famously carried a magnifying glass so she could check the minutiae of their architectural drawings at all times, but also her kindness. So back to you, Paola.
Having gone to architecture school when you still used ink, I am terrified by the idea of a professor with a magnifying glass. Well, I hope that Nipa will give us an archi tour. And I am continuously surprised by the tradition of female architects that we've been covering also in contemporary times in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. It's really quite amazing, and it's great to get to know more about it. And I'm going to move now to Marty. Let's talk about Martha Goddard, that is. I'm back in the United States because, as I mentioned, I want to make a point or two today. And in the early 70s, Chicago faced a staggering number of sexual assaults, almost 16,000 annually. Yet less than a tenth were reported, and even fewer resulted in convictions. Martha Goddard, called Marty, was a dedicated community activist and victims advocate. She recognized the systemic failures that allowed perpetrators to evade justice and decided to work on them. Working with teenage runaways, she encountered numerous survivors of sexual abuse and realized that the lack of standardized evidence collection was a significant barrier to prosecuting offenders. In a new book just published titled The Secret History of the Rape Kit, a True Crime Story, author Pagan Kennedy writes that Goddard, and I quote, went into the crime lab. She interviewed everybody there. She went to hospitals. She talked to administrators, nurses, everybody. Goddard designed a standardized kit to collect and preserve forensic evidence from sexual assault survivors. No small feat. Before the development of this standardized kit, evidence collection in sexual assault cases was haphazard and inconsistent. Medical personnel lacked guidelines, leading to incomplete or contaminated evidence. Marty's rape kit itself is a simple yet potent tool. A small case, perhaps made of cardboard, containing items such as sterile nail clippers, cotton swabs, slides for holding bodily fluids, paper bags, and a tiny plastic combs, and instructions to follow carefully. However, implementing this idea required collaboration with law enforcement, and Goddard therefore approached Luis Vitullo, a surgeon in the Chicago Police Department's crime lab. Initially, he was dismissive, but eventually he recognized the potential of her proposal and developed a kit based on her design. Unfortunately, due to history, gender bias, and political dynamics, the kit was named the Vitullo kit, overshadowing Goddard's pivotal role. So the adoption of the rape kit began in the late 1970s, and by September 1978, 26 county hospital emergency rooms had incorporated its use into their standard practice. Less than 2 years later, 215 hospitals across Illinois were using it, but Goddard did not sit still. She founded the Citizens Committee for Victim Assistance in the mid-1970s, advocating for the adoption of the rape kit even further than Illinois. She secured initial funding, believe it or not, from the Playboy Foundation, enabling the distribution of these kits and training of medical and law enforcement personnel in their use. Despite her groundbreaking contributions, unfortunately, Goddard lived her later years with personal struggle. She battled alcoholism and lived in relative obscurity in Arizona, passing away in 2015. Her invention, however, has had a lasting impact, providing a crucial tool in the fight against sexual violence and offering survivors a path to justice. I'm so glad that there's this new book that's been published only about her.
Indeed, but so late. I mean, so cruel, outrageous, and utterly unfair that she was denied the credit for her own design work. But also, what a timely reminder that actually many of the most important and interesting design interventions are in areas that people don't associate with design at all, but sorely need the particular skills of designers and their anticipatory attributes to develop sustainable solutions to major problems. Now, it's a wonderful story. Now, our final hidden heroine, or in this case, heroines, plural, are a remarkable international network of women, mostly from remote rural communities and economically disadvantaged areas of the global south, and they are known as the Solar Mamas. Since 2000, over 3,500 Solar Mamas, all over the age of 35, with little formal education, have left their homes in 93 countries, including Cameroon, Guatemala, Malawi, Nepal, Senegal, and Tanzania, to train in electrical engineering for 6 months on the solar program at the Barefoot College in Telonia, northwestern India. They were sent there, all from places without electricity, to learn how to design, fabricate, install and repair electronic devices, particularly solar panels and solar-powered lights, and then to teach those skills to other people in their communities as part of the solar program, which was started by Bunker Roy, the activist and social designer who founded Barefoot College. Its aim is to ensure that every woman and girl has the skills and knowledge she needs to be a catalyst for change to the benefit of herself, her family, and her entire community. And by training the Solar Mamas to install and maintain solar power in their villages, the solar program aims, 1, to give the communities access to clean renewable energy, 2, thereby reducing the carbon emissions and health risks created by charcoal, paraffin, kerosene, and other expensive, potentially toxic alternative fuels, and also for the Solar Mamas themselves to benefit from sustainable incomes that can give them greater educational and economic opportunities, and of course, greater self-confidence and a sense of purpose. Without electricity, their communities had been impeded in many ways, from wild animals attacking livestock at night, to their kids having to stop doing homework as soon as it's dark, and from their family incomes being constrained by limited working hours for the same reason and the dearth of employment opportunities, particularly for women. The Solar Mamas programme has already transformed over 2,000 villages by installing electricity there, and its impact should become even greater and expand even faster in countries like Senegal, where new recruits are already being trained locally by Senegalese Solar Mamas who originally studied in Telonia. The same cycle should then benefit future generations of courageous and ingenious Solar Mamas and their families, their friends, and their communities.
I love the name Solar Mamas because it is almost like a sci-fi group. It's like, you know how much I love science fiction. So I can see the Solar Mamas that are just wearing these beautiful uniforms and adornments and then just take over the planet. Every time you mention them, that's what I think.
It is a very joyful name. It's true, and definitely positions them as super duper heroines.
So thank you for this. Beautiful. So it was just a great conversation that we had. And, like every year and like every day of our life, Alice and I strive to celebrate the work of designers, professionally trained or accidental, of architects and of artists that use our field to change the world. And many of them are female. Many of them are immigrants. Many of them are people of color. Many of them have not had it easy and have not been properly sung or even treated. We could not ever imagine, however, as striking a step backwards in the rights of women as well as transgender, non-binary people, not to mention immigrants and people of color, as we are seeing today throughout the previously progressive Western world. So this celebration on Women's Day takes on an even heftier weight, and we thank you for being with us. Let's celebrate everybody. Let's not go backwards. And please follow us also in future episodes. You're going to find images that are connected to what Alice and I described today in our Instagram platform at design.emergency. And you will find on all podcast platforms previous episodes that celebrate women, people of color, immigrants, even males from all over the world that try to use design to make the planet a better place for everyone, including other species. We thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and happy International Women's Day.